for the little princess. The house chosen was Hatfield, some 20 miles to the north of London, where a little court was established. This was normal procedure for a royal infant, but the peculiar circumstances of Elizabeth's family life were to give it a special importance. Years later, Elizabeth made the point herself when she quoted St. Gregory to the effect that, "We are more bound to them that bringeth us up well than to our parents, for our parents do that which is natural for them, that is, bringeth us into this world. But our bringers up are a cause to make us live well." Not that her parents were deficient in natural affection. Indeed, Anne Boleyn took pleasure in giving Elizabeth the prettiest clothes and equipment, caps which were made to measure, in purple and white satin, each covered in a caul or net of gold, gold and silver trimmings for her little bed or cradle, and fringes for her great bed, in which she lay in infant state when she received important visitors. But behind the bright little princess there was another figure, who followed her like a gloomy and reluctant shadow. For there were two victims of the annulment of Henry VIII's first marriage. The first was Catherine of Aragon, repudiated after 24 years of devoted married life, and the second was her daughter Mary, who at the vulnerable age of 17 found herself declared illegitimate. Catherine was reduced from queen as Henry VIII's wife to mere Princess Dowager as his late brother Arthur's widow, while Mary was demoted from princess and inheritrix of England to the Lady Mary, the king's bastard daughter. Both mother and daughter steadfastly refused to recognize either the loss of their formal titles or the transfer of these titles to their successors. Catherine's resistance was serenely regal. Mary's had more than a touch of teenage hysteria, and against the two women the king's council wielded every weapon of humiliation and calculated insult. Worse, from Catherine's point of view, was the enforced absence of her daughter, whom she was not allowed to see, even when she was dying. For Mary, however, the council devised an even sharper torment, requiring her to be perpetually in the presence of her successor, Elizabeth. When Mary arrived at Hatfield, she set herself to be as difficult as possible, and she would not acknowledge Elizabeth as princess. She was, she explained, prepared to call her sister, just as she referred to the king's bastard son, the Duke of Richmond, as her brother, but she would never address her as princess. And despite her father's studied neglect, the loss of her jewels and the refusal to serve her food in her chamber, she stuck to her guns. It is just possible that some of Elizabeth's earliest memories were of Mary, red-eyed and resentful, stamping her foot as she refused to curtsy to her baby half-sister. We know these details of Mary's treatment thanks to the dispatches of Eustace Chapuis, Charles V's ambassador to England. Charles V, Catherine's nephew, ruler of Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, and Holy Roman Emperor, was furious that his power, which had been able to block Henry VIII's divorce in Rome, did not extend to protecting his aunt and his cousin. So he let his ambassador off the leash. Chapuis schemed and plotted and cajoled, and the Habsburg embassy extended an open welcome to any dissident members of the English court. To judge from Chapuis, there seemed to have been a lot of them, and in the highest places in the council and the privy chamber, which served as the king's personal staff. Some were undoubtedly sincere, and were to pay with their lives. Others were simply reassuring themselves against a possible turn of the tide. For Chapuis, Elizabeth was the little bastard, and her mother, Anne Boleyn, the great whore. Many others at home and abroad used the same language or worse. One reason for the loathing was an outraged sense of personal and dynastic loyalty. But there was an ideological aspect as well. Anne Boleyn has gone down in history as one of the great femmes fatales. It is not a role that we associate with fervent religious commitment, but Anne and her brother George, Lord Rochford, were enthusiastic sponsors of the new developments in religion. Both drew their inspiration from reformed circles in France. Anne had large, lavishly illustrated copies of the Psalms and other religious texts in French prominently displayed in her chamber, and encouraged her ladies to read aloud from them. The result was a deliberate contrast to the household of Catherine of Aragon, famous for its orthodox Catholic piety. The commitment of the Boleyns to reform was partly temperamental, but it was also a logical consequence of their position. Catherine's Catholic piety, added to the refusal of Rome to annul her marriage, meant that the defence of the Aragonese marriage became increasingly identified with Catholic orthodoxy, and Catholic orthodoxy, for its part, flung its weight behind the defence of the Queen and her daughter. None of this left the other side with much choice. The Boleyns had to back reform, and the reformers, on the whole, backed the Boleyn marriage. So the lines of future political and religious division were emerging, and even in the cradle, Elizabeth was a symbol. On Friday, January the 7th, 1536, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton. "God be praised," Henry exclaimed. "We are free from all suspicion of war." On the Sunday he entered the Chapel Royal clad all in yellow, and Elizabeth, who was visiting the court for the Christmas festivities, was carried in to Mass too, with the sound of trumpets. After dinner Henry took his little daughter in his arms, like one transported with joy, and showed her off to the assembled company. Anne Boleyn rejoiced as loudly as her husband, but in fact Catherine's life had been one of the chief props of her own position. While his first wife lived, Henry could not be seen to be getting rid of his second. Anne's other defence was the fact that she was again pregnant, but on January the 29th, the day of Catherine's burial, Anne miscarried of a 14-week-old fetus. It was just possible to identify it as male. Anne was reported to be terrified that she was about to repeat the experience of her predecessor. The king was in great distress, and he had fallen for Jane Seymour. Anne sealed her fate by the method she chose to try to win Henry back. She flaunted her sexuality. At the beginning of their relationship, this had driven him into her arms with jealous lust. Now it provided the evidence to bring her down on charges of multiple adultery and incest with her brother, a favourite musician, and 3 gentlemen of the king's privy chamber. She was executed in the French manner, kneeling upright with a sword, rather than prostrate on the block with an axe. "I heard say the executioner was very good," she remarked to the lieutenant of the Tower, "and I have a little neck." She was correct on both counts, and her head came off with a single stroke. Anne Boleyn's death was a terrible blow for Elizabeth, and her father's role in it more terrible still. But how deep the wound went we do not know, as Elizabeth never wrote or spoke a single word about it. Despite the pathetic story told much later of the accused Anne holding out their daughter to Henry in mute appeal, Elizabeth was almost certainly not at Greenwich at the time of her mother's arrest, but 20 miles away at Hunsdon in Hertfordshire. Mary, we know, had been moved there at the end of January, and, as she was a mere appendage of her younger sister's household, we can assume that Elizabeth had gone there too after the Christmas holidays, and at Hunsdon the horror of the events in the capital was inevitably muted. There was some impact, of course. The shower of lovely clothes which Anne Boleyn had lavished on her daughter suddenly dried up. This had a practical impact, as the child quickly outgrew her now static wardrobe. Within a few weeks she had literally nothing to wear. We can imagine her bitter, childish humiliation. We can also speculate that it was to avoid its repetition that the adult queen was to fill her wardrobes to overflowing with hundreds of dresses. At this point, the head of her household, Lady Bryan, wrote a letter to Thomas Cromwell, the royal secretary, making the point very forcibly about the child's shortage of clothes. She also asked for guidance about her status and how she was to be treated. This has been taken to mean that Elizabeth was in deep disfavour. Actually, it shows no more than her being temporarily forgotten, which, with the excitement of the king's marriage to Jane Seymour, was hardly surprising. Such neglect was heartless, but it was not serious. The rest of Lady Bryan's letter dealt with Elizabeth's problems with teething and her general perfection apart from that.